There are executions that echo because of what is said at the end, and then there are executions that haunt history because of what is never said at all. On a cold execution night inside a maximum security prison in the American South, the state prepared to carry out a sentence using a method so rare, so controversial, that even seasoned prison officials spoke about it in hushed voices. There would be no last meal, no farewell message, no final confession, no apology. The name on the paperwork was Jessie Hoffman. And what makes this story different, what separates it from the countless capital punishment cases that came before, is not just the method the state chose, but the quiet resistance that preceded it. A man who refused tradition, a system testing a new frontier, and a prison holding its breath as history crept down its corridors. This is not just the story of an execution. It is the story of a prison under pressure, of unseen preparation behind locked doors, and of a moment where silence became the loudest sound in the room. Before we explore what led to that final night, and why the world was watching this case so closely, understand this. Everything about Jessie Hoffman's death sentence challenged the rituals the death chamber was built on. Executions in America are surrounded by routine. There's a script, a final meal request, a spiritual advisor, last words recorded for the public record. Families on both sides waiting for closure that rarely comes. But on this night, those customs collapsed. No chaplain reading scripture beside the gurney. No food tray sliding through a steel slot. No statement to be archived in state records. Just preparation, procedure, and waiting. And before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're re-watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The prison where Jessie Hoffman spent his final years was not built to make headlines. It was built to contain time. Concrete walls thick enough to mute screams. Steel doors designed to erase individuality. Long corridors where footsteps echo long after the officer has passed. This was a prison that had executed before, by older methods, older rules. But nitrogen gas introduced something new: uncertainty. In the days leading up to the execution, normal routines quietly shifted. Shift schedules were adjusted. Maintenance crews were instructed to stay late. Specific rooms, rarely used, were inspected again and again. Inmates sensed it before they were told. When guards become quieter, when meal times tighten, when radios crackle with coded language, men locked in cells know something is coming. And this time, it wasn't just another execution. It was a test. For the prison. For the state. For the future of capital punishment itself. Jessie Hoffman was more than a DOC number stamped on a uniform. Long before death row, he was a name spoken in a courtroom heavy with grief and anger. His conviction stemmed from a violent crime that shocked a community and left a permanent scar on everyone involved. Prosecutors painted him as calculating. Defense attorneys argued trauma, instability, and a life shaped by chaos. Years passed. Appeals came and went. His name faded from headlines but not from records. On death row, Hoffman became known as quiet. Not withdrawn, not disruptive, just controlled. He read. He wrote. He avoided attention. Other inmates would later say he spoke rarely about the crime, but often about systems, about power, about choice, about how the state defined justice. And when the state offered the customary last meal and final statement, Jessie Hoffman made a decision that would follow him into history. He refused both. The last meal isn't about food. It's about ceremony. For decades, prisons across the United States have granted condemned inmates the chance to choose a final meal, a moment of control at the end of total captivity. Some request comfort foods. Some ask for childhood favorites. Some refuse entirely. Jessie Hoffman's refusal was not casual. It was deliberate. According to those familiar with his final days, he viewed the ritual as performative, an act that made the public feel humane while changing nothing about the outcome. No participation, he allegedly told prison staff. That refusal unsettled more than guards expected. Because when an inmate rejects ritual, the system loses part of its script. There would be no tray to photograph, no list for the media, no symbolic closure, just emptiness. Last words are recorded, archived, and often quoted for decades. Some are angry. Some are spiritual. Some apologize. Some curse the system. Jessie Hoffman gave none. The official record would later mark the section blank. Witnesses would note the moment when he was asked, one final time, if he had anything to say. He looked forward. He breathed. And he said nothing. In a process driven by documentation, silence became an anomaly, a statement in itself. For victims' families watching from behind glass, the silence cut differently. Some wanted remorse. Some wanted acknowledgement. Some wanted anything at all. They got nothing. And that nothing would linger long after the chamber emptied. Nitrogen gas execution is among the most debated developments in modern capital punishment. Supporters describe it as efficient and controlled. Critics argue it lacks sufficient historical precedent and raises unanswered ethical questions. Prisons adopting new methods must train staff from scratch, procedures rewritten, equipment tested, contingency plans rehearsed repeatedly. For this prison, nitrogen wasn't just an alternative, it was uncharted territory. In the days before the execution, select staff were briefed privately. They signed additional paperwork. They were told not to speak to colleagues outside the assigned team. This wasn't just about security. It was about liability. When a system breaks tradition, every move is scrutinized. On death row, time doesn't move the same way it does for the rest of us. For Jessie Hoffman, execution day began early. He was awakened not with urgency, not with comfort, but with simple, stark information. This was the day. He was permitted to shower. He dressed in standard prison-issued clothing. He gathered his personal belongings, which were so few they fit neatly into a small cardboard box. As this quiet, methodical routine unfolded, other inmates listened from their cells. The sounds of a door opening, of footsteps, of a shower running, these were the sounds of a countdown. Some men prayed. Some cursed into the concrete walls. Others pressed their ears against the cold surface, straining to hear the finality in every footstep, every metallic click of a lock. But after that initial stir, 4 hours, nothing happened. There was just waiting. That suspended moment, caught between the certainty of what's coming and the completion of the act, is often described by prisoners as the worst part, more agonizing than the execution itself. And Jessie Hoffman faced that wait. He faced it without ceremony, without any distraction, and without a single word. Executions, no matter how controlled they appear, are never truly private affairs. There are always witnesses. Official witnesses include prison officials, legal representatives, and a carefully selected group of media observers. Their presence is meant to guarantee transparency, to ensure that the state's ultimate power is administered according to the law. But this transparency has its limits. What the witnesses are allowed to see is tightly controlled. What they can hear is restricted. And what they are permitted to describe afterward is often governed by strict policy and legal statutes. As they waited to be escorted into the viewing area, a sense of gravity settled over them. Many understood they weren't just about to observe the death of a man. They were about to witness the debut of a method, a new procedure that could redefine how the state administers its ultimate punishment for years to come. Inside the execution chamber, the final checks were being made. Outside, the entire prison was on lockdown. Jessie Hoffman was escorted forward. He offered no speech. He showed no resistance. There were just the soft sounds of his footsteps on the floor. Then, just moments before the process was set to begin, protocol demanded one last confirmation. His identity, his sentence, the authorization. Everything in that room moved according to a precise, rehearsed policy. Everything except the silence. The quiet in that room was different. It was heavy, absolute. It was a silence that seemed to absorb every other sound, every breath, every unspoken thought. It was the moment just before everything changed. Inside the execution chamber, the air felt heavier than usual. This wasn't just because of what was about to happen. It was because no one in that room had a historical script to follow. Executions by older, more established methods followed decades of repetition. Officers knew exactly where to stand, when to move, and what to say. But this time was different. Every detail had been rehearsed on paper far more than it had been lived in practice. Jessie Hoffman was positioned according to the new protocol. Restraints were secured with a clinical, detached efficiency. Each officer performed their role with a precision that bordered on stiffness, their movements deliberate and measured. No one spoke beyond what the procedure required. No one held eye contact for more than a necessary second. The chamber lights cast a steady, unwavering glare. The thick glass separating the witnesses from the room reflected their own faces back at them, faces filled with a mixture of expectation, confusion, and a quiet, profound unease. They were watching something entirely new unfold. Before any execution can proceed, the authorization must be confirmed out loud. It is a legal ritual, a final checkpoint designed to ensure that this irreversible act is fully and lawfully sanctioned by the state. A senior official stood and read the order. The words were formal, impersonal, and absolute. Jessie Hoffman was then asked one last time, as required by the rules, if he had anything to say. The room waited. Seconds stretched out, feeling like minutes. And again, there was only silence. That silence didn't delay the process. It couldn't. But it changed the entire energy of the room. It stripped the moment of its potential for narrative. There would be no famous last words for the history books. There would be no dramatic soundbite for news anchors to replay. There was only an empty space where words were supposed to be, a void that spoke louder than any final statement could have. What followed unfolded without dramatics. There was no chaos, no spectacle. The execution team initiated the new procedure exactly as they had been trained. The equipment functioned as expected. The timelines were followed with strict, unwavering adherence. From the witness room, observers noted how incredibly quiet everything remained. There were no alarms, no raised voices, no sudden movements. This was all by design. The new method depended on calm, on consistency. Any deviation, any unexpected event, would have triggered an immediate halt and a full investigation. Medical personnel monitored the process from their assigned positions, their eyes fixed on their instruments. Legal witnesses watched the clocks on the wall, documenting every passing second. And through it all, Jessie Hoffman remained outwardly still, a silent figure at the center of a meticulously controlled event. Afterward, the witnesses struggled to describe what they had just seen. This wasn't because it was chaotic or gruesome. It was because it defied their expectations of what an execution looks like. There was no single, defining moment they could point to. There was no clear line where life visibly ended and the procedure concluded. It was a process, not an event. Some would later say that the profound stillness of it all unsettled them more than any other execution they had previously observed. The reporters who were present were restricted in what they could publish. Their descriptions had to remain general. They could report the timelines, the sequence of events, but their observations had to stick to officially sanctioned language. What they could not describe, however, was the emotional weight of watching a death so intentionally stripped of all ceremony. A death that was as quiet and clinical as a medical procedure. At a legally designated moment, a qualified official confirmed the death. The pronouncement was brief. It was quiet. It was final. The clock on the wall, which had been so important just moments before, now no longer mattered. There was no applause. There were no announcements beyond the formal declaration. There was no visible reaction from the staff beyond a controlled, disciplined professionalism. The witnesses were then escorted out of the viewing room in the same quiet, orderly fashion they had entered. The chamber was cleared. And just like that, with barely a sound, history had been made. But an execution doesn't end when the chamber door closes. In the minutes that followed, the entire prison shifted into a different operational mode. The equipment was secured. The extensive documentation process began. Staff who had participated in the execution were quietly rotated out. On death row, the lockdown remained in effect longer than usual. This wasn't because of any unrest or trouble. It was because the administrators wanted to ensure there were absolutely no complications, no ripples from the event. Inmates in the nearby cell blocks reported an eerie calm that night. There was no shouting. No one was banging on their doors. There was just the familiar, constant hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the shared, silent knowledge that a man who had been there just yesterday was now gone. When the state released its official statement, it was exactly what you'd expect from a legal team: cold, factual, and neutral. It described the execution of Jessie Hoffman as having proceeded according to protocol. A time of death was confirmed. The method, nitrogen gas, was identified. But what wasn't said spoke volumes. There was no mention of a final meal, because he refused one. No mention of last words, because he offered none. In a system built on ritual, these omissions were jarring, and they quickly became the center of a national conversation. The public reaction was immediate and deeply divided. For some, the execution was seen as a technical success, a new, efficient method working as designed. For others, the very newness of it was a problem. Should a method with so little history carry such an irreversible consequence? Advocacy groups seized on the symbolic power of Hoffman's silence. Legal analysts debated what it meant for a condemned person to completely disengage from the process. Even the families of his victims were split. Some felt a sense of closure, while others expressed frustration, saying his silence denied them the acknowledgement they had waited years for. There was no unified response, only a growing list of questions. Back on death row, the silence echoed differently. Jessie Hoffman's cell was cleared out, just as policy dictates. His personal items were catalogued, some returned to family, others destroyed. For the remaining inmates, his absence was felt immediately. A quiet man who was part of the daily rhythm was suddenly gone. His execution wasn't just a reminder of their own mortality. It was a warning that the system itself was changing, evolving in a way no one could have predicted. The rules were being rewritten, right before their eyes. This prison wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a silent witness to decades of human history. Long before Jessie Hoffman's arrival, this facility had housed some of the nation's most infamous offenders. The guards had seen it all, or so they thought. They operated on a simple principle: routine is safety, and safety is survival. But nitrogen executions were new. They completely changed the landscape. Training manuals had to be rewritten from scratch. Protocols were reviewed again and again. Risk assessments were doubled. Even the most seasoned staff admitted to feeling a deep sense of unease. They weren't just watching a man die. They were participating in an experiment, a test of a method with no precedent and no collective experience to fall back on. Some officers later said they felt like they were being forced to make history, whether they wanted to or not. Executions leave scars that are rarely visible outside prison walls. Behind every procedure, there's a person managing their own emotions and calculating risk. Guards who oversaw Jessie Hoffman's final hours spoke later about the immense weight of it all. One officer said, "Even when you train for this, you feel it. The paperwork can't prepare you for standing in that room and seeing the silence. Silence is louder than words." The medical staff felt it too. The novelty of the nitrogen method meant every single detail was under intense scrutiny. Every valve, every dial, every system was tested multiple times. When it was finally over, there was a sense of relief, but it was a complicated relief, mixed with heavy reflection. These professionals are trained to be impassive, but even they admitted that moments like this stay with you forever. For the other inmates, the execution was a chilling event. While most weren't allowed to witness it directly, they heard the telltale sounds, the heavy footsteps, the clanging of doors, the low mechanical hum. They knew something extraordinary was happening. The reaction inside was a mixture of fear and quiet reflection. Some privately celebrated the system's authority, while others silently rebelled against it in their minds. Hoffman's refusal of a last meal and last words quickly became the stuff of prison legend. In a place designed to strip away every ounce of personal control, rejecting the final ritual was seen as a powerful act of agency. And in the culture of death row, that is something that is never forgotten. The story of Jessie Hoffman didn't end when the chamber door closed. Legal scholars immediately began to question everything. Was this new nitrogen gas method truly humane? Did Hoffman's refusal of traditional rituals, no last meal, no final words, carry a hidden meaning that the law should have considered? What kind of precedent did this silent execution set for the future of capital punishment? Ethicists joined the conversation, raising alarms about the state experimenting with untested execution techniques. Advocacy groups argued that denying last words and a final meal was a form of psychological coercion, a way for the system to silence an inmate completely. Politicians tiptoed around the subject, unsure how the public would react. One man's silence had started a nationwide conversation that echoed through courtrooms, universities, and newsrooms. Hoffman couldn't have known it, but his refusal to participate became a central part of a debate that was much bigger than him. In today's world, a story like this can't stay behind prison walls. Headlines exploded across every screen. Nitrogen gas execution conducted in silent ceremony. Condemned inmate refuses last words and meal. The internet went into a frenzy. Legal forums were filled with speculation. True crime communities debated Hoffman's motives and the meaning behind his silence. Social media was a battleground of opinions, from outrage and anger to deep philosophical reflection. Some saw Jessie Hoffman as a defiant rebel, making a final stand against the system. Others viewed him as a broken man, withdrawn and stoic in his final moments. But no matter the interpretation, the story went viral. His silence became its own form of communication, a message that was louder and more powerful than any speech he could have given. It was a blank canvas onto which everyone projected their own fears, beliefs, and questions about justice. Executions are designed to be sterile, controlled procedures, but the psychological toll on those who witness them is immense and often hidden. Correctional officers who are repeatedly exposed to death report that it fundamentally changes them. Some describe a slow numbing of their emotions, while others carry a heavy, constant awareness of mortality that never leaves. Witnesses, too, are forever marked by the memory. Even when an execution is calm and procedural like Hoffman's, watching someone die without the familiar rituals of a final meal or last words creates an unsettling void. It forces a level of reflection that can't be easily dismissed. For the prison staff, Hoffman's execution became a landmark case, a new method, new rules, and a silence that left an indelible mark on everyone present. Even the legal teams admitted a deep sense of discomfort. The impact of that silence was more powerful than anyone could have ever scripted. In the months that followed, Jessie Hoffman's case became a media fixture. Documentaries were produced, long-form articles were written, and interviews explored every angle. Ethicists debated the morality, historians provided context, and lawyers meticulously analyzed whether every procedure was followed correctly. In every single telling of the story, one detail remained at the absolute center: Hoffman's refusal of the traditional rituals. His silence had become his legacy. It was an act that was interpreted in countless different ways, but it was impossible for anyone to ignore. Long after the headlines faded, his execution remained a key reference point in debates over capital punishment, its methods, its ethics, and its psychological impact on society. Jessie Hoffman's story isn't just about one man's final hours. It's a mirror held up to society, forcing us to look at our own rituals surrounding death, justice, and control. It makes us ask uncomfortable questions. Are these protocols, the last meal, the final statement, truly in place to honor the humanity of the condemned, or are they just there to make the rest of us feel better about what's happening? It shows us that power, procedure, and personal choice intersect in complex and often invisible ways. And most importantly, it proves that even in the face of absolute authority, a single individual can disrupt the entire narrative, not with a grand speech, but with quiet, deliberate silence. In the end, Jessie Hoffman will not be remembered for his crime or his final words. He will be remembered for refusing to participate, for asserting a final shred of control in a system designed to take it all away. He left the public, the prison staff, and the entire justice system with a giant question mark where they expected a period. In the long, complex history of death row, silence can be louder than any speech, and the choice to refuse can echo for generations. Jessie Hoffman left no last meal, no last words. But he left a profound question for all of us. In the final act of the state, who truly holds the power? The one who carries out the sentence, or the one who chooses not to play their part? This story challenges us to think, to question, and to understand the incredible weight of both ritual and refusal. Because sometimes, the most powerful statement is made not by what is said, but by what is deliberately left unsaid. Thanks for watching. If this story made you think, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the questions that shape our world.